And I think its importance is highlighted perfectly by just what's been happening in the US over the past few days, past few weeks, past 4 years. Hello everybody, my name is Maya. Welcome to my channel if you are new, and welcome back if you are returning. Today we're going to talk about something really important, which is English class curriculum, specifically in secondary schools or high schools. If you're new here, I am a junior in high school right now. I go to a public school, pretty great school. I'm really lucky and grateful to go there, but it definitely has some flaws, specifically when pertaining to the English department, and the most glaring one for me is the diversity in the books we read. It's recently come to my attention that there is an organization called Disrupt Texts, which is pretty much a bunch of teachers across the country, maybe across the world, I honestly don't know, who have come together really in support of diversifying English curriculum, and I think that's so amazing. Totally go check them out if you have Twitter or social media of any kind other than YouTube. If you've gone to American high school, you probably are familiar with the classics, right? We've got Catcher in the Rye, we've got The Great Gatsby, Copyright is Gone, it's such exciting stuff. What else have I read? Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, Shakespeare, Macbeth last year. I actually quite like Macbeth, not gonna lie. And if you're not familiar with the titles themselves, you're probably familiar with the authors. They belong to a long-gone era in American history, whether that be Mark Twain and his Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, or J.D. Salinger in like the 50s and 60s. I think that's when he was alive. I'll check that for you. And despite the continued significance of not only these authors, but these stories, they don't reflect the students in classrooms today. I believe that the ratio of white students to students of color at my school is pretty half and half. I live in an area that's populated by a ton of different ethnicities and cultures. There's a lot of Vietnamese people in my community, Latinx people, East Indian people. I feel very grateful to have had the opportunity to live in such a culturally rich and diverse place. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to me that all of the books we read in school and all of the themes and morals we derive from those books that help shape not only who we are, but in some cases who we are as readers, don't reflect anybody I really know. Up until this year, the only book in AP Language and Composition, which is the class I'm currently in, the only book by a person of color was The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. Definitely a super important book, but every other book was white, and every other book was also written by a heteronormative, cisgender man. My peers and I have been working for a really long time to get this changed, and this year they introduced a couple of new books into the curriculum that I was thrilled about. One of those is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is so exciting because I haven't read that, and it's like such a classic, and I kind of love sci-fi. I think it has that in there. Also, it's a novel by a woman, it shouldn't be groundbreaking in curriculum, but kinda is. The other book was Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which we just finished. As I mentioned in my Goodreads review of Between the World and Me, I was very upset by the way this book was taught. It wasn't. When I say this book wasn't taught, I mean it literally. The last book I read for my English class this year was Columbine by Dave Cullen, which is about the Columbine massacre that took place in 1999. It was an incredibly written book. It took a journalistic approach, which I appreciated so much. It treated real people as characters, but not in a way that was degrading at all. It was just a really fantastic account of something that does impact me and my fellow students really all the time. I mean, I grew up in a world of really stringent airport security. I was born post 9/11. I grew up in a world with security guards in schools and metal detectors and lockdown drills. So that's not necessarily an example of a diverse book, but it's definitely a book that is applicable to students, and that was also new this year, so I was super excited. We had multiple class discussions about it. We had lots of assignments. We had to do like external reading, like, they'd give you supplemental material to read so that we could have more conversations. At the end of the day, it was a relatively well-taught book, even though I still don't like English class. It's my least favorite class at school. So when we were told that our next book would be Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I was elated for several reasons. The first is that my peers and I have worked really hard for a long time to get more Black literature in particular, but just generally more diverse books in mainstream mainstream English curriculum, and this seemed like a huge step forward. Secondly, as I just mentioned, we finished Columbine, and that was a really powerful exploration of literature that I got to have with my friends and with my teacher, and I felt like we had really productive conversations. I was hoping that same amount of care and nuance would be applied to this novel. And unfortunately, it wasn't. Now, I will preface by saying that I understand that we're in a pandemic. Trust me, I know. And I also understand that politics is something that cannot be talked about a lot in public schools. Teachers have to be very careful about introducing their own biases into the classroom. And I get that. But at the same time, teachers have the resources, at least in my district, which again is something I'm so grateful for, to teach us pretty much as normal. Of course, it's harder to communicate with students. It's harder to encourage collaboration, things like that, but conversations can still be had, and they weren't. Secondly, whatever is political in this book is not necessarily controversial or shouldn't be, and that is just the blanket statement of Black lives and experiences matter, deserve to be read about, talked about, explored, and that allyship is a good thing. What amazed me about my teacher's approach to Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I want to just mention briefly, I know this isn't my teacher's fault, I know there's only so much individual teachers can do, and that this is a systematic issue that needs to be addressed, if not nationally, then within districts. Sorry if you hear like banging, the basement's being worked on right now. But I can only speak from my experience with my particular teacher, and her approach was really not to teach this at all. We didn't have a single essay, whereas on the Columbine book, I had at least 2. Our class discussions were brief and kind of trite. My favorite part would have to be when she asked me, a white girl from the suburbs, to explain the cultural and just national significance of historically Black colleges and universities. That happened. Yeah. We didn't have any assignments on this book, essay or otherwise. We had no in-class activities. We had no supplemental reading. It was very disappointing. And throughout all of this, my teacher kept repeating the message that, like, we worked so hard to get this book into the curriculum. I hope you guys are grateful. This is a really avant-garde approach, things like that. And I was like, you can't tell me that you are successfully incorporating important Black literature into your curriculum if it's not being taught. I would also like to emphasize here that when I say being taught, I don't necessarily mean being taught in the same way as classic English curriculum like Catcher in the Rye. This book should totally be approached differently. And that is because the Black lived experience, particularly in the United States, is something of its own. It's an individual story, and when I say story, I mean stories, because no group of people is a monolith. This book should have been approached with just extra care and extra conversation and perhaps guest speakers. Like, I had so much hope for this because I felt that not only would we as students be able to extract things we need to pursue education, such as understanding rhetorical analysis and synthesis and metaphors and all that jazz, but I was hoping we would come away with kind of a group cultural understanding, or at least curiosity. I hoped people would be inspired to read more Black literature, read more about the Black experiences of the United States and of the world. And to be quite frank, I don't think probably 3/4 of my class even read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I don't think it's because they were disinterested. I think it's because English class historically has made people less inclined to read. That is anecdotal, but pretty true if you think about it. I didn't read for the entirety of middle school because English class kind of burnt out my love of reading. I was so tired of reading the same stories and suffering through old language, which again is important but isn't like all-encompassing. I was so burnt out on that I didn't pick up a book on my own until 2020, which is pretty sad because literature, as I hope you know, is so powerful and so influential in developing who we are as people, as all media is. At the end of the day, I suppose my point is it's not enough to buy hardcover copies of the book, stamp your barcode in it that says it belongs to the school district, and distribute it to students. Books have to be actively taught, diverse or otherwise. You can't give a kid a copy of Catcher in the Rye and then expect them to have a complete understanding of, Halden Caulfield and the unique American experience of coming of age. teach. There has to be active teaching, and that was missing fundamentally from the approach to this book that my school and my teacher took. It was really disappointing to me. It made me very upset, but it also showed me how much further we have to go and how important it is that I keep talking about this and that you keep talking about this and that we collectively, as students, as readers, as consumers of media in general, we need to keep talking about this because it's really important. And I think its importance is highlighted perfectly by just what's been happening in the US over the past few days, past few weeks, past 4 years. As you've probably heard dozens of times from, comedians and politicians and journalists alike, the attack on the United States Capitol was shocking, but by no means was it surprising. Confederate flags were just waved in and walked through the United States Capitol building. A guy with a t-shirt that said Camp Auschwitz was attacking the Capitol building. People died. And no matter your politics, I think we can probably all agree that hatred is bad and that death is not good. I think it's also important to talk about what happened at the Capitol in comparison to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I want to be cautious here for a couple of reasons. A lot of people in my classes were talking about the response to what happened at the Capitol in comparison to what happened during Black Lives Matter, where peaceful protesters who were honestly just fighting for their rights and for their lives, again, shouldn't be controversial, were tear-gassed. People were hurt for peaceful protesting, but when there was a riot at the Capitol, nothing. Or at least nothing for quite a long time. The response was incredibly delayed. My school had a huge opportunity with this book, and just imagine what incredible conversations we could have had as the emerging generation of Americans had we really actively read this book, had we talked about it consistently, had we written essays about it, formed our own reactions to it, talked about it, messed up, made mistakes, reconvened to talk about how we can do better. Imagine how much we could have learned and benefited as people had we read this book and then watched what inevitably was going to happen at the Capitol, then watched what's happened at Black Lives Matter protests across the country and across the world. Imagine how we could have used what we learned at school to create a better and more equal tomorrow. Ultimately, that is my problem with the lack of diversity in books. Representation matters so much, but so does empathy. And those two things combined really sum up my opinion on why we need diversity in schools, and diversity in books in schools, and diversity in media at large. People need to see themselves represented, and they also need to see other people represented. We need to learn about each other and learn to respect our differences and find curiosity in learning about new people and new cultures and new ideas, while also respecting the fact that we are all human. That is something that English class has the potential to really enforce into the minds of young people. And if we can channel goodness through literature, through books, through school, if we can really encourage and nurture empathy and compassion and a capacity to listen, I think we could really make a better tomorrow. And that is why I'm so upset that my school did so little with the novel Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, because this is an incredible book. In the words of Toni Morrison, it's an examination of the hazards and hopes of Black male life, and it is both profound and revelatory, which it absolutely is. I will never understand the full extent of this book because it's not my lived experience, and that's okay. My teacher, who is white, will never be able to understand the full contents of this book, and that is also okay. What is important is that we take that first step, that we are brave on a systematic and educational level, that we take the leap, we do something uncomfortable for the sake of a better tomorrow and for the sake of all people. I hope that next year my school will take a lot more into account when they decide to teach diverse books, because diversity in schools shouldn't be a checklist. Diversity shouldn't be a checklist in general. Clearly, I'm quite passionate about this topic. I would love to hear what you all think down below. Interestingly enough, these tend to be the videos that get the most dislikes on my channel, because I guess empathy is controversial. But I hope that one day it won't be, and I think that is where I will leave you today. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I will see you later in the week. I hope you're staying safe and well, and as happy as you possibly can be given everything going on right now. January 20th is fast approaching. Please be safe. Yeah, and I'll see you next time.